Sandy Mackey is an experienced public servant and nonprofit administrator with a background in multi-stakeholder collaboration, rural community planning, and equitable housing policy. He works regularly with local government, health authorities, and regional coalitions across British Columbia. And Sandy holds a master's degree in planning from Dalhousie University. So welcome, Sandy. And Sandy,
thanks, Anita. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, you're presenting remotely, right? You're not in the room in Vancouver.
I am not, but I do have control of the slides, thanks to Sharito, so hopefully this works. It should be fine. Thanks, everyone, for having me, and thanks, Anita, for inviting me to speak today. Before we get started, I just want to recognize the work that Interior Health has done to support and forward a lot of this work. This is sort of the outcome of what has been almost a year working with their Healthy Communities teams to change the way that we're talking about housing and look at different ways that health authorities and other health-related professions can interact with housing, and especially the new funding streams and the momentum for housing across British Columbia. It's really exciting. I'll also say that I would normally have my webcam on, but unfortunately, in order to activate it, I would have to quit and restart the program, and I really think that that would mess everything up for everyone, so I will be yet a third disembodied head today. But next time, I promise I'll be on the screen. Thanks very much for the introduction, Anita. I am coming to you from Victoria, British Columbia, the unceded Coast Salish territories of the Lekwungen-speaking and Wasanich peoples. It's really important to me as a planner. The more I work in British Columbia, the more I see how the processes of planning, the way we ascribe value to land, the way we ascribe use to land, are rooted in colonialism and in colonial ways of thinking. So the more I work in this province, the more I engage with my own practice and reflect on my practice to work to contest that through planning. So I'm hoping that as we move forward with these, we keep that in mind, and as you interact with planning in the future, you keep that in mind as well. So we're going to, again, my name is Sandy Mackey. I'm a community planner with BC Healthy Communities. We're a province-wide not-for-profit society that facilitates the development of healthy, thriving, and resilient communities. We provide a range of programs, services, including planning processes and resources to support communities and local governments. And we operate at the intersection of planning and community well-being or public health. So we have a diverse team of planners, public health professionals, facilitators, as well as research and evaluation specialists. You might know us best, Plan H program. Plan H is a project that we facilitate on behalf of the Ministry of Health. And our deliverables are, we emphasize three key objectives through our deliverables. First is local government support, which includes things like grants and project expertise. The second is health authority support for things like education. We advise and develop resources. And the final is collaborative support. So we emphasize local government and health authority partnerships throughout all of our projects. Since 2012, we've supported almost 200 communities across the province with an additional 34 communities in the 2018-2019 funding year. So more likely than not, your community has received funding through Plan H, no matter where you are in the province. So we're pretty excited to be in the very far north right now, up as high as the Daly Dene First Nation. And, of course, we have projects in the very far south in Victoria. The goals for today, we're going to talk a bit about the Housing Needs Reports funding and program that have been renounced and mandated by the provincial government. And then we're going to talk a bit about best practices and areas that health authorities and other health partners or interested parties can interact with that process. So a bit of background on the legislation. Effective April 16th, 2019, provincial government requirements require that all local governments complete a housing needs report for their communities by April 2020. They will also have to complete a housing needs report or update that housing needs report every 5 years afterwards. There's a lot of information available online. In this presentation, will just be giving you the sort of what I've been able to glean from the website. For more detailed information, I would suggest that you visit the actual website where the program requirements are located. That's the link there, and I will make sure Sharito sends these slides out so you have access to that. For those of you who are working in local governments that may already have or are already working on a housing needs report, there is a possibility that they may be considered to have met the legislated requirements for their first report. And if that's the case, we recommend that you contact the Ministry of Housing and Municipal Affairs for more information. It's all on the bottom right of your screen there, and they've been very helpful so far in all of my interactions with them. Our guess is that if your housing needs assessment has been done relatively recently and utilizes the most recent census data and also meets the requirements of their legislation, which I'll be talking about, then it will be probably okay to use an older one. But we definitely check up on that before you move ahead. So the legislation regulations have two specific requirements, the first for information collection and the second for report content. I'll go over both of those. Local governments will be required to collect approximately 50 kinds of data, including current and projected population, household income, economic data, et cetera, et cetera. There are 50 key indicators that will be made to collect. And the good news is that most of that data is going to be available through the provincial government. They've actually established a catalog of all the data that you will need to meet those base 50 indicators, which is really good news. And a lot of that is pretty basic information about your communities that may already be available. So it's things like that the census or that other places would have. The report contents are a little bit different. They're required to contain information on the number of housing units needed to meet the current and anticipated housing needs. They need statements about key areas of local need, i.e., our community needs seniors housing, our community needs supported housing, those sorts of things. And as well, they need to have information about the number and percentage of households in core housing need and extreme core housing need. We talk about core housing need as being spending more than 30% of your income on housing, and then there's also other indicators about that's affordability, and there's also indicators about appropriateness and condition of the home. Extreme core housing need, I believe, is if you're spending more than 50% of your income on housing. So those are the type of people that we consider in extreme risk of homelessness. At extreme risk of homelessness, they are one paycheck away from not being able to pay their rent. And then finally, there's a standardized summary form. So what's missing from all that? I think that as people who work in the health field, we can see that a lot of the information that is required does not necessarily make for a full picture of what housing is in your community. Those 50 indicators are great, and it's a great place to start, but it's not going to give you the information you need to adequately address housing in your community. And that's where the new funding program comes in. So the provincial government has allotted $5 million over the next 3 years to support housing needs reports development. It's a pretty substantial outlay of money, and it's being facilitated through the Union of BC Municipalities. Your communities can be eligible for up to $150,000, which is a really exciting amount of money because it means you can do more than just the bare minimum for this study. You can really set your community up to address housing needs now and in the future, and to do some really interesting things when you're looking at how you're collecting your data and who you're collecting your data from. I've also included a list of the eligible costs and activities here, but I won't go over those. All that information is available through the Union of BC Municipalities. If you are interested and if you are hoping to interact with a local government around this program, please feel free to get in touch with me or visit the website for more details. And the selection committee is actually going to be grading applications across a variety of different platforms, including, and I've highlighted some of the most important ones, there's a really strong portion of the application that asks for demonstration of community consultation and public engagement, including collaboration with neighboring local governments, First Nations and local Indigenous organizations, nonprofit service providers, health authorities and/or post-secondary institutions, not-profit and for-profit development sectors, and vulnerable populations. So this is really where a lot of the health and equity work can go to throughout this process. There's also some work where looks like capacity building for local government staff is also going to be on this list. So trying to build capacity not only in how to repeat this study in 5 years, but how to keep collecting information, how to keep building health and equity into all of these processes as they move forward. So applications can also include up to 5 letters of support, which is another great place to work with your local governments. I know that Interior Health has been writing a lot of letters of support for these projects, and I think that's a pretty exciting place to, thanks, Anita. I think that's an exciting place to start, but not where your involvement has to end, to say the least. The first deadline for the funding was May 31st, so a lot of you probably have seen some of your communities with applications in. We don't expect to hear back on all those funding applications until sometime in September, October, November. No one really knows yet. But there is a second deadline for funding at the end of November 2019. So if your community has yet to submit an application, there is a deadline coming up later in this year, and now would be the time to start preparing. So that's the boring part. All of that information, again, is available via the Government of British Columbia and the Union of BC Municipalities websites. But here's some stuff that we've been working on with Interior Health, some of the best practices and some of the ways that health and equity can be integrated into this process. First and foremost, as you are preparing to submit your application or preparing to undergo this study, partnership is one of the key tenets of an effective housing needs report. We're recommending that you try to install broad sector advisory committees before your housing needs report is being done. A broad sector advisory committee can include service providers, Indigenous organizations and governments, regional representation, and representation from health authorities, et cetera. There's a lot of different models for these sorts of committees. We have seen on the island, instead of having a committee that's run by the municipality, we've been looking at the Community Health Network model as acting as a de facto committee, which is really exciting. We've seen them be arms of council, so different councillors would have housing as part of their portfolio, and there would be a group that councillor likely chairs or sits on that would then make direct recommendations to council. It's just really important that these different partners are in the formative stage of your housing work. And then the second piece is that the UBCM funding is actually going to incentivize regional collaboration. Communities are eligible for far more money if they do housing needs reports regionally rather than as an individual community. So that's really exciting. If you want to take a look at how much money your community would be eligible through this funding stream, it's all available at the UBCM website, and I've left a link there with the actual dollar figures. You can actually look up how much money your community would be available and then how much money it would be available to you if you partnered regionally, and it's substantially more. So that's really exciting. When you're conducting your housing needs report, there's a few best practices that we are trying to highlight. First and foremost, data collection. This is going to be the biggest part of the conducting of the report. And the reality is that in smaller communities and in communities that are, resource dependent, Statistics Canada can be notoriously unreliable. The data is only collected 5 years, and anyone who works or lives in a resource-dependent community knows that if your mill shuts down, data from 5 years ago is no longer that useful to you. So it's really important that you are expanding the way that you collect data through these studies, looking for work plans that focus on both quantitative, so numbers, as well as qualitative data, community stories, interviews, key informants. Avoid cookie-cutter work plans. So avoid, if you are sitting on an advisory committee or if you're a member of council that's making a decision about what consulting plan to go for, look for ones that are tailored to your community. Look for engagement plans that the consultants are coming to your community for a number of different visits. Look for engagement plans that are committed to getting to the context that makes your community different from others. And look for engagement techniques that meet people where they're at and leverage community assets. And then also broad sources of data are really important, not just census data, but how are different voices being captured through this process. So when we talk about healthy or equitable community engagement, we're talking about engagement that is reflective, authentic, and transparent. Reflective engagement requires consideration of the barriers to engagement processes and how some people may consider those practices inaccessible. It means asking who is participating and providing input and who is being excluded, either purposefully or due to the systemic barriers in your engagement process. As a planner, I'm happy, it's unfortunate that we have to talk about this, but it is very true that planning has been critiqued for being inaccessible to Indigenous peoples, newcomers, youth, older adults, and people with diverse abilities. And this is a great opportunity to change the way your community does engagement work, to try to address that and to be reflective about how those practices may promote some voices and exclude others. Authentic community engagement means that the planners in your community are genuinely interested in hearing from community members and can acknowledge their understanding of the community up to this point has maybe been imperfect. And finally, transparent. Community members need to be aware of exactly what they're being engaged about, what agency they have over the decision, and why. And part of that means reporting back to your community as well to show them where their engagement was heard and how it was incorporated into the document. So this is an example of what some of the work that we've done in our housing needs report process. The graphic is not perfect, but it does show the way we've tried to capture different voices from across the spectrum of housing using different engagement techniques. For example, we've had a huge, broadly distributed online survey that worked really, really well. But when we were designing our engagement practice, we tried to think of who would not be able to participate online survey. And the answer for us was that people who don't have access to computers regularly, who may not have internet access, who may not be computer literate. So it was important to us to go much beyond a survey and conduct key informant interviews with service providers who have direct access to people who are experiencing homelessness or are actively working their way through the housing spectrum. And as well, we conducted some lived experience interviews, which were basically a version of the survey with less questions, with simpler, more common language, and were designed to be administered by service providers during the course of their work to their clients. So a great example is at the Head Injury Society, which works with adults who have experienced head injuries and does work retraining and helping them change their lifestyles to better support their new abilities. They would actually, as a part of their work and a part of their regular interviews, administer this survey as a way to both do their intake and as well to measure progress of their clients. And it was really exciting for us, some of the responses we got. And then finally, informal engagement. This is engagement that was done in person in the community. We would stand outside of grocery stores or the gas station or outside of the community center distributing information about the survey and the survey itself. As well, we would stop and talk to anyone who had more questions about it and try to get as many people involved in the process as possible. A big piece of this was that we actually visited in person every Indigenous band office in our study region. It was very time-consuming, but it ended up being incredibly important, and we ended up getting a lot more information from folks that I don't think we would have engaged otherwise. For example, the study region is the Strathcona region in the middle of Vancouver Island, and the main hub of the Strathcona region is Campbell River, but about 150 kilometers away is a small town called Gold River. And we took it upon ourselves to make sure we did the drive to Gold River and to actually drop into the municipal office and drop into the band office that's located there. And when we showed up, people told us that so many times consultants that come to the region forget that the road goes both ways. And immediately upon showing ourselves in the community, we generated trust and buy-in for the project that we wouldn't have via telephone or via internet. So some other great engagement techniques would be focus groups or direct interviews with people including municipal officials or service providers, and finally ethnographic studies. So borrowing from a lot of different disciplines is a really exciting way to expand planning practice in your communities. And because we did all this work, I think we got more information than we would have expected out of our study. one of the key things that we found that was a key determinant of housing and health in Campbell River or in the Strathcona region was racism. And it was a really interesting finding that I don't think we would have gotten elsewise. And it was something that we were able to express in our findings that I think will have a broader impact, not in just housing, but across how that community operates. Some of the stories we heard were really incredible. The one on the bottom right there, my husband is First Nations, my children are half, as I am white. When my husband went to look for a place or apartment, etc., it was not available. I went to the same place and it was available. Not all places are like that, but there are a few here. So there are some really effective quotes that came out of this study, and those quotes, more than the data, have been, we found, more effective at conveying housing needs in that community. So some of your public health colleagues will be familiar with this graph. Not everyone is, and it is a little complicated to look at, but once you understand what we're going for, it will be pretty, I think it can be a pretty effective tool moving forward. So this is universal proportionalism or proportionate universalism. I can never remember which one, but basically it's saying that across the socioeconomic spectrum, which is the bottom axis, and across the health and well-being spectrum, in the middle there's a health and social gradient. And the solid line is what the current health and social gradient is, and the dotted line is our desired health and social gradient. And basically what this is saying is that resources need to be distributed not equally across the socioeconomic spectrum, but equitably. So people who are needing to be more support need to receive more support, and people who need less support need to receive less support. So we kind of modified it to show it in relation to the housing spectrum, where we see affordable rental and home ownership on the far right, and emergency shelter and transitional supportive housing on the far left. And we included that in all of our recommendations. So when we made recommendations, we would recommend more things that would support this side of the spectrum and less that would support the top right side. And traditional planning techniques tend to focus on this top right because they're the easiest. They're where you can integrate technical solutions into your communities. So it's really exciting to be able to visualize, use this spectrum and incorporate that into our recommendations and priorities. And then after your project is done in the implementation, there's a couple of things that are really important too, like your findings. They should be really accessible. So many housing needs reports are walls of text and data that are indecipherable to people who actually need to use it. Service providers, nonprofit housing providers are all going to be using this data, not just planners. And it's really important to try to display that information in a way that everyone can access and use it. So look for community profiles, look for plain language, and we really liked infographics. They're colorful, they show the information in a way that is more appropriate for visual people, not just planners, people who read. That's a really effective way to distribute your information after the fact. And then also, it's always great to have action-oriented recommendations, so inform and prioritize housing action. Don't just be comfortable with distributing information. Look for priorities and recommendations. And the good recommendations will use community strengths and not focus on deficits. That's a pretty standard asset-based community development approach. And then lastly, building capacity is a really exciting part of this grant. Local governments you're actually eligible to apply for funding to support local government capacity building so that they can repeat the report in 5 years. But is there an opportunity to include nonprofit housing capacity, or is there a place where you can lobby for a coalition of service providers that can also be funded through this work? And a big thing to avoid is those siloed solutions that I talked about. This is an article that came out earlier this year. It's talking about the neighborhood plans in Vancouver. And so over the course of those neighborhood plans, a planner did some research and found that in each of I think it was 10 neighborhood planning areas, housing got more expensive. So it's kind of a tough thing. When we plan, we tend to make places more predictable. And when we make places more predictable, we tend to make them easier to invest in. And so that's kind of the catch-22 of this work. is for everything that makes a place easier to invest in and might make housing more expensive, we also need to be focusing, and maybe even focusing more on things that contribute to a more systemic understanding of our housing. So when you're critiquing processes, again, think back on this and think, who does this intervention benefit, who does not benefit, and why? And then can you place your intervention along this support gradient? So let's say you're looking at some secondary suite bylaws in your community. Secondary suite bylaws largely support people who already own their own home and people who are already able to access market housing. They may bring down the cost, the average cost of a home, by a few percentage points, but they are not going to change the cost of a home so substantially that someone who is already unable to access market housing will now be able to access market housing. So that's the kind of intervention that would go somewhere in here. So for every one of those things that you do, you should be focusing on doing 2 or 3 on this end. It's an oversimplification, obviously, but sometimes we need to hyperbolize in order to make our point, and I find this graph is a really effective critical tool that I use when I work with communities. So that is it for me, but I do want to share that there is a new Healthy Housing Action Guide available through the PlanH website. It highlights a lot of the things that I've talked about here and does focus on some of those regulatory solutions as well as partnership and planning solutions. So if you're interested, it's available on our website. And we do have physical copies, so if you are attending a conference sometime in the next few months, hopefully we'll be there with some copies. And maybe for the next meeting, I will send Sharito some copies that she can distribute. If you'd like to learn a bit more about how health authorities specifically can add value to the Housing Needs Reports process, we're going to be hosting our own webinar on July 8th at 10:30. Register via this link, and it's going to be a bit of repetition of some of this material, but hopefully we're going to expand some of the theory behind how health and housing work together. And as well, we're going to be featuring Katie Hunter, who's on the call today, and we'll actually have some communication techniques from our communication specialists for how to talk to local government representatives and folks in local government about housing. That's it for me. If people have questions, I think we can go to those.
Thanks, Sandy. That was really great.